If I asked you to list the 10 most important albums in rock and roll history, what would you list? Chances are your list would be different than mine. There might be some that are the same. I mean, some albums are just important. They probably belong on this list, whatever your personal tastes are. But these are my 10 favorite that I want to list for you. Now, there's other important albums, certainly throughout rock and roll history, throughout the decades, the last 5 or 6 decades, that should be on here. But I don't really care for them all that much. For example, say Michael Jackson's Thriller, all the millions and millions of albums that he sold with that. But I never listened to that. It's not an important album to me. So some stuff like that I'm going to leave off. But I'll give you what I feel are my 10 best, and I have reasons for these too. They're not my favorites, okay? And they're not necessarily my favorite album from that particular group, but they're all very important in the history and the annals of rock and roll. And I'm going to list them for you. I'll show them to you, and I'll explain my reasons why. So the first one I have, actually the back of this is a little better, is the Chicago Transit Authority, otherwise known as Chicago. It's their debut album. Great, great, great album. So why is this so important? Well, it's a double album. You usually don't get a band releasing a double album as their first album. And they were something different. Now, the main reason for their difference is because they incorporated horns. They had a trombone, a saxophone, and a trumpet, along with your standard other guitar, bass, keyboard, and drummer. And throughout the 40s, into the 50s, you had the big bands. Then you had the Motown sound of the 60s, which Phil Spector brought forth the horns into. And James Brown certainly used a lot of horns, and then from that point on, Tower of Power, and maybe the best of them all was Earth, Wind, and Fire. But when Chicago appeared, they were different. They first of all they looked like musicians. They all had long hair. They were all white, for one thing, and they had three lead singers. They had the smooth Robert Lamb. They had the gruff, rugged tone of Terry Kath and the soulful voice of Peter Cetera. And the horns did more to form the basis of their sound than any other horns actually ever did. And that first album just really brought that kind of attention, that kind of detail to our attention. And they did it wonderfully. They did it beautifully. A lot of talent there in that band. And just really enjoyed that album quite a bit. And it gave us a whole new style of music to listen to a whole different audience that maybe never would have listened to this kind of music before. I also want to point out that the trombone player James Pankow was also a songwriter for the band too. So that's a little bit different too. The Rolling Stones used horns in their live shows later on with people like Bobby Keys and others. But this was the first really introduction we had to horns and rock and roll by rock and rollers. Okay, and it's a great, great album. They went on to produce a whole bunch more albums. A lot of them were double albums, but this was the first, and it was super important. The second album that I'm going to list is I don't have it anymore. I had it years ago, and it's the Allman Brothers Band, Eat a Peach. You might say, why Eat a Peach? Their most impactful album up to that point had been Live at the Fillmore East. And after they released it, they were truly headed to superstardom. But their leader, the man who formed the band, who put it together, and who was just the heart and soul of the band, Duane Allman, was killed in a motorcycle accident in 1971 at the age of 24. This was the first album that was released after he died, and it had some of his work on it. Now, half of the album is a continuation of Live at Fillmore East. They have that one whole side is Mountain Jam, and the other side is a couple more songs with Duane and Dickie and everybody else. And then another side of it is the last compositions with Duane and the first compositions of the band after Duane died, before they really became a Southern rock band. We got to hear the beautiful Blue Sky, Dickie Betts' composition with him and Duane trading their pentatonic scale solos. We got to there's just a lot of great songs on that album. You had Little Martha, which was Dwayne's acoustic solo piece by himself, the last thing that we would hear from him. But it was the first side that really made this so important because it was a band that could have disbanded. They could have said, we just don't have it anymore. This was Dwayne's project. It was his baby. It was his idea, his leadership. You know, he was the leader. There's no question about it. He was the leader of the band. And he was gone just like that. You know, just in one unfortunate moment, he was gone. And Dickie Betts wouldn't let that happen. So they wrote a few more songs, and they started on the road back. And a couple of them are just classics. Yeah, the first song on the first side is "Ain't Wasting Time No More," and Greg wrote this, and Dickie pulled out that slide. And he played a little slide guitar like Dwayne did, and he did a pretty good job with it. Les Breuer's in E minor, and the incredibly beautiful Melissa, which was a song that Greg had been writing for quite a while, and you know, you could feel the sadness in his voice and the tragedy of losing his brother, the leader of the band. And so Eat a Peach showed that you can move on after tragedies strike a band. And they did. They became a different band after that. They were much more of a southern rock band, more of a country style. But my hat is off to them. This is a wonderful, beautiful album, Eat a Peach. I loved it. I wish I still had a copy of it, but it remains very high on my list of my favorite albums, and certainly belongs on my list of one of the 10 best, most important albums in rock and roll history. Next, a British band that many of us are familiar with, and that's The Who. Probably most people would say that their most important album is Tommy, and I certainly would agree with that. It's a rock opera, the first time anybody ever heard of a rock opera, and it's a concept album, and it was remarkably brilliant by Pete Townshend and what he tried to put forth in it, the damage that we could do when we speak things to a young person, to a child, a boy or a girl, and how it could impact their lives. Well, they had that huge success of that. They followed it up with Who's Next, their next album, which was actually another project that kind of went off the tracks called Lifehouse. So what do you do next? Is this the end of the brilliance of The Who during this period? Or are they got to come up with other things? And people were waiting. Well, they came up with this, Quadrophenia. And another rock opera. It's really what it is. And Pete had the idea during the 60s, you had the Mods versus the Rockers. And this album, this CD, centers around that conflict between them. And they actually made a film, Quadrophenia, where a young Sting is in, by the way, before the Police were famous. And it captures really well the feeling of what was going on in the 60s with those two factions, the Mods and the Rockers. But the reason why I count this as an important album, number one, it showed that you can do it again. And if you have enough talent, if you're innovative enough, as Pete Townshend surely is, you could come up with something else along that same line as Tommy was, a rock opera, and do it again and do it in a different way, not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, but just something different and something equally as brilliant. And that album also, for me, when I listen to it, I hear the emergence of something called the lead bass. The Who they'd come out in the 60s with My Generation. And that's the first time you heard John Entwistle playing a lead bass part in that song. And if you're not familiar with it, listen to it then. You'll hear it. And you say, oh yeah, that's right, that is the bass. And Pete Townshend talks about that openly. He was more of a riff and rhythm guy. He could play solos, but he'd rather just crunch those rhythm parts out. And John Entwistle filled in all that with his remarkable lead bass playing. Listen to the first song on the album, Can You See the Real Me? Listen to his bass on that. And throughout the album, it's just astonishing what this guy does. He's a brilliant bass player. A lot of people recognize him as the top bass player in all of rock and roll. And I certainly can understand why. There are a lot of great ones, but John Entwistle really stands right at the top along with maybe one or two others. Also, everybody excelled on this album. Keith Moon brought himself into a more mature, different way of expressing himself. He has the power. But listen to his drumming on Love, Rain, or Me. with playing the timpanis and the gong and everything. He had a textures that maybe I don't think I've ever heard before from him on his previous albums. Um, of course, Roger Daltrey, this is his best vocal performance. From that pretty boy image that he has, he went into this with the gruff, powerful vocals, and he always did have them, but I think he took them to another level on Quadrophenia. And Love Reign O'er Me might be the best vocal performance that he ever had. It's just chilling. Listen to the power in his voice and the way he conveyed Pete Townshend's lyrics. And of course, Pete playing the piano, the ideas that he had with the rain and everything, the whole concept of that album is just a remarkable achievement for this band. You think of it as kind of like a heavy metal band, with their crunching riffs and everything, and they're the crazy lunatics that are Keith Moon and everything else. This is just a landmark album, and it's a very important album in rock and roll history. And they never achieved anything like this again. So they had that 3-album run, which was fantastic, culminating in this. So next I have this album here. You might say, what? Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, really? Well, yeah, and I'll tell you why. This sold a ton, over 25 million albums. I'm not even sure how many it was. I should have looked this up. But this was a hugely successful album for this group. Back cover here with the 5 of them. Fleetwood Mac started off as a blues band. And the rhythm section was Mick Fleetwood on drums and John McPhee on bass. And that's where they called themselves Fleetwood Mac. They had Peter Green. They were nothing like the Fleetwood Mac of the 70s. And then they changed a little bit over the next few years. They added Bob Welch, became a little less blues, a little more rock. Christine Perfect, who married John McVie and became Christine McVie. They added her with her singing, her keyboard, and her songwriting. And then they decided to add the 2 Americans, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, and they became this super group called Fleetwood Mac, which is what most people remember them as. And they had a string of highly successful albums in the 70s, with Rumors being on the top. And all excellent songs in there. And I wouldn't call them pop. They were rocking. Different. They were just different. They kind of had their own niche. You know what I mean? They really didn't fit into anybody's category. But they went from those beginnings into a powerful force, and stayed that way for decades. And that was an important album in rock and roll history, Rumors. And just the sales alone kind of bears that out. Not that necessarily means, like I said, I talked about Thriller, but still, from them to change from what they were to what they became was really quite an accomplishment for this band. And they kept that same rhythm section with Mick and John, and it's still Fleetwood Mac. So next, the Yes album. Okay, 1970. There they are. Kind of funny, the biggest picture on there that you see is Tony Kaye playing the keyboards, and this is his last album with them, because they replaced him with Rick Wakeman after this album. He's a terrific keyboard player. This was Steve Howe's first album with the band. And why is this so important? Because this made progressive rock listenable. If you listen to some of the stuff that came before then, progressive rock was almost classical in a way, sort of. You could appreciate it, you could appreciate the musicianship, but like the melodies and the lyrics and everything weren't quite there. And what exactly is prog rock, anyways? Well, they're lengthy pieces, depending on the song. There's no set limit. Just 4 minutes, 5 minutes. It's got to be more than that. It starts off with "Yours Is No Disgrace," which is over 9 minutes, and 4 of the songs on here are fairly long. And Steve added so much to the band with Chris Squire's bass playing and John Anderson's voice and Bill Bruford's incomparable drumming. They brought attention to progressive rock. And yeah, the lyrics are kind of out there a bit. You're not sure exactly what is being sung about, but it made a huge impact on the people who listen to music, not dance to music, not necessarily got stoned and just spaced out on music, but actually listened to music and appreciated it. And it paved the way for their 2 brilliant albums to follow, Fragile and Close to the Edge, which are like at the pinnacle of progressive rock. So that's a super important album. the Yes album. Love this. It never gets old. It's over 50 years old. Next on the list, I'm cheating just a little bit here because I have to mention this band and their front man, which is basically the whole band. They only put out a couple albums before he died. Of course, I'm talking about Jimi Hendrix. So I did pick this up a little while ago. It's their smash hits, and it's got everything on here. It's got all the Hey Joe, uh, Purple Haze, Crosstown Traffic. It's got everything. And one of my very favorites of Hendrix, "The Wind Cries Mary." And what's really cool about this too is I got to show you this if you haven't seen this. It's a purple disc for Purple Haze, I guess. Jimmy, so different. I mean, how can you define what he meant to music? Uh, just such a shame that he killed himself the way, with his excesses. But in that brief 2 or 3 album span, he left us so much. Now, he had Electric Ladyland, Are You Experienced? They're great albums on their own. But with such a short career, I can make a case for just that greatest hits. Although I wouldn't necessarily call that an album, so to speak. But for such a limited amount of material, I'm okay with doing that. And that was a mind-boggling new force in the world of rock and roll. I mean, he played with James Brown too, and Jimi Hendrix left us way too soon, but boy, did he leave us something to hold on to. And so I list that one as one of the top 10 albums. And if you want to, you could take one of the other albums, Electric Ladyland or Are You Experienced, put it in there, but then you're leaving the other one out, So you see where I'm coming from. All right, now another British band here, and I know this is going to be a little bit strange. This is not their best album. Most people won't ever say that it is, but I'll tell you why I think that this is one of the 10 most important albums in rock history. Led Zeppelin 3. Love this little, spins around here. Got this dial. See how it changes in you. I saw them live in the Yale Bowl shortly after they'd come out with this album, John Bonham. Well, they had their 2 monster powerhouse albums, Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, filled with chunking riffs and blues and things that you just never had heard before. They were just, man, did they explode onto the scene, Led Zeppelin. The inside of it kind of looks like the rest of it. It wasn't well received, though, because rock critics, mainly the rock critics, and the general listening public in general, after hearing songs like Heartbreaker, Whole Lotta Love, Dazed and Confused, Communication Breakdown, we thought they were going to rock the world out on their next album. Well, when you put it on the turntable, the first song you heard was the Immigrant Song. You said, oh wow, great song, the Immigrant Song. And they had another really good rocker with great riffs on it that closed off the first side called Out on the Tiles. Aside from that, it's pretty much an acoustic album. Jimmy Page wanted to pull out his Martin acoustic guitar, and they wanted to write more subdued, country-ish, show a different side of the band, a lighter sound of the band, and still give you something special, something beautiful. And they did it with Led. They did what they wanted to do. That's what makes this important. They weren't playing to anybody's taste. They were doing what they wanted to do, what they knew was best for them. They understood that. And it also transitioned the band from those heavy first couple albums into the 4th album, which is the Stairway to Heaven album, which is a blend of everything in there also, of heavy stuff, of light stuff, of folkish music. They could do whatever they wanted, and they showed that they're not just a one-trick pony. And Led Zeppelin 3 gave them that springboard to do whatever they wanted in the albums to follow, probably culminating in one of their most powerful albums, Physical Graffiti, a few albums until a few years before John Bonham died also. So I feel it was a very important album, and I just like the idea of artists who know they're good and they know they have something to share, and they are sharing it the way that they want to do it, not the way a record company executive is telling them to do it or the public is. And all these years later, a lot of people are coming. More and more people that I've heard, they say, I love this album, Led Zeppelin 3. This is great. There's absolutely nothing to complain about with this album, and glad that they did it, right? So that now I got my last three here. The Ultimate Concept album, 1972, by that group from Britain with the one-legged flautist. Of course, I'm talking about Thick as a Brick. We have the original album here. With the, how cool is this? Huh? It's a newspaper, the St. Cleeve Chronicle. It's got everything. It's kind of fallen apart a bit, but it's got all the pages intact and everything. Thick as a Brick. Well, their previous album was Aqualung, one of the greatest albums ever. Just absolutely one of the greatest albums ever. Aqualung is, listen to it. You should listen to it. So the next album to come out, Ian decided on something totally different, Ian Anderson. He made a fictional character called Gerald Bostock, and Little Milton. He came up with this poem about a jaded view of life from his young age. They called him Little Milton, and had approximately 45 minutes of music. And there's different segments to the album and to the music, but there's really just one long song, and it moves from all different kinds of phases. It has great ideas in it. Each one of them, some I like more than others. Obviously that's going to happen. Some of them are just genius. The poet and the wise man stand behind the gun, listen for the crack of dawn, light the sun. That section, that where the hell was Biggles when you needed him last Saturday, all that. The the jock straps pinching, they slouch to attention. I mean, everything in there. That bum bum ba da dum everything. It just one idea after another. And he even said it. They don't necessarily flow all that smoothly. The changes could have been better, but the idea that they could come up with this and keep it cohesively together somehow into a 45-minute epic that when it was over just made you say, wow. And after Aqualung, and then they followed it up after this with a Passion Play, tried to follow the same formula, and it didn't work really as well for a lot of people. But I love the Passion Play too. I thought that was an excellent album too. Not quite to the level of Thick as a Brick. Then the band had enough of that, and they went back to just more albums, and they put out a lot more albums after that. Jethro Tull just kept pumping them out year after year. But Thick as a Brick was just a super important album by a band doing something that they wanted to do, that they had the confidence to do, and they didn't care what anybody thought. So that definitely belongs on this. I love this. Still love it. I still listen to it all the time. Love it very much. So my favorite band always has been, always will be. Nothing will ever change that. I'm 72 years old, and I was 10 years old when they first appeared on American TV. And of course, I'm talking about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So which album of theirs would you choose then, if you were agree that one of their albums should be one of the top 10? Several of them certainly fit that bill. Sgt. Pepper's, The White Album, Abbey Road, maybe Rubber Soul. But this one to me is a clear choice, and it's not my favorite. It's about my second or third favorite, I would say. Of course, I love it. I love all their albums, but this is just a fantastic album, Revolver, and it's really the second album that they. It's the back of it. It's got the picture of the guys back there in sunglasses, and you don't open it up. It doesn't have an insert, but it's got that cool that drawing on there. Um, Rubber Soul was really like the first album that anybody put out that was like an album. You know what I mean? It wasn't just a collection of songs. It had a personality, had an identity. And this is the follow-up to it, Revolver. But what makes this so special to me is the different things that they were doing on there. But the tone of the guitars and the way they use their electric guitars on this album, on songs like And Your Bird Can Sing, She said, Taxman, and it wasn't always George too. It was John and it was Paul too. Playing the electric guitar also on some of these songs. Then when you add um, something totally unbelievable that they would put on a rock and roll album called like Eleanor Rigby, which didn't have any guitars, any drums, any bass, just strings and an evocative picture of life and of sadness. I mean, it's just pure genius, and it showed what could be done. It was 1966, and the album ends with "Tomorrow Never Knows," which was psychedelic stuff that you know uh, you know Strawberry Alarm Clock was singing, people like that, Iron Butterfly, Pink Floyd, from their early stuff. But this is just a great album, and everybody is so good on it. George's songs, John's songs are fantastic. Paul with his ballads, everything just mixes together. George wrote great songs, and Ringo sings "Yellow Submarine" for us. Um, a landmark album. I mean, I know I say that for a lot of these, but it really is a landmark album for the Beatles, for people who were listening to music at that time. And that's another thing too, is that if you were there when these albums came out, you know how important that they were. Looking at them 40 or 50 years in the future, it's not the same as it was when they came out. And I was only 13 when this came out, Revolver. But was really struck by it. Always will be. I love this. I just love it. Um, and I had all of these back in the day. Some of these they're newer versions that I bought, like Revolver, the Yes album, um, Led Zeppelin 3. Actually, my girlfriend gave them to me as presents. Um, but I wish I still had all those original albums. I wish I still had Eat a Peach. And she also gave me this one. This is the last one that I'm going to present to you today. And this, I think, is the most important album that anybody ever did. So is it the Rolling Stones? No, not really. I love a lot of their stuff, but they could be in the top 10. I don't know, the Doors. Um, could be the Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. I mean, all kinds of different bands that you could name in that. But there's one album that stands out for me as the very best thing I have ever heard, and I'm going to tell you why. It's from Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon. And this is their best album. Came out in 1973. They're trying to decide on they're trying to decide on the album cover, and when this was shown to them, they all agreed instantly when they saw it. They loved it. So what's so great about this album? Well, you're familiar with the songs, with Money and Time and Breathe and all that, and there's a theme that runs behind this, and it's that life is ebbing away fast. And there's a hopelessness in this that Roger Waters and David Gilmour and Nick Mason and Richard Wright brought forth with their with the lyrics, with the music, with their instruments, and the incredible, unforgettable performance by Claire Torrey, trying to describe what it felt like dying, giving up life when you're not ready to. Now, a little disclaimer on this for me. I know Gilmour and Waters are they're professed and confirmed to be atheists. No, I'm not. Um, but they brought forth an idea and expressed it in music of what it must be like for someone who has no hope beyond what they see before them in a day-to-day material world, knowing that someday that's going to come to an end and believing that you're simply going to cease to exist. And I think that that's a fear and an angst and an anxiety, especially when you're young and you're thinking about that you just cannot dwell on. It's just too sad to even think about. And they put it into this album, and it came out spectacularly. Uh, Roger Waters' lyrics on this are they're beyond belief. I mean, give this album a listen if you haven't recently, and listen to everything that he says in his lyrics, because they are mind-boggling. They you could not do it any better than this. And the music, David in his guitar tones, he's not the flashiest guitar player. There's faster players. There's a lot faster players. But what he plays is just a tone, and it's his soul coming out. Even if he doesn't believe he has a soul, it's coming out in his guitar playing. Richard Wright, the piano leading into The Great Gig in the Sky before Claire Torrey begins her lament. Genius. Nick Mason on top of everything with his drums. Perfect, not too loud, not too soft. Those chords, the use of saxophone, and the fact that David Gilmour sings all the songs until the last two, when Roger Waters comes and he sings the last two, Brain Damage and Eclipse. It's just a brilliant accomplishment by this band. And if you're trying to bring something across, whatever it is in music, and you manage to lay it down and put it on an album as well as they did with Dark Side of the Moon, you have achieved something, and it definitely deserves to be in the top 10. And it is my favorite Pink Floyd album. Not everybody agrees, but I think you're wrong. They never did anything better than this. Not Animals, not Wish You Were Here, and those are great albums too. Not The Wall. This is it. It doesn't get it. And I was 20 years old when this came out, so you're gonna have to take my word for this if you weren't around when it came out. People said, "I don't believe this. I don't believe how good this album is," and everything about it is just top notch, perfect. And kudos to them. This will live forever. I think it's the most important album in rock and roll history. So anyway, let me just show you them again. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. The Beatles, Revolver. Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick. Led Zeppelin 3. The Jimi Hendrix Experience Smash Hits. The Yes Album. Fleetwood Mac Rumors. Quadrophenia by The Who. Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers Band. And the debut album by the Chicago Transit Authority, simply called the Chicago Transit Authority, later to be called Chicago. So think about that. Maybe you just would like to think about your what you consider the 10 most important albums for you in your lifetime, and what your reasons are for choosing them and for liking them. There's really no wrong answers. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but think about it and think about what makes an album important. When I was young, there was a TV program that Dick Clark hosted in the '60s called American Bandstand, and they had a segment on it called Rate a Record, and they put a new record on. They usually had a boy and a girl there, and they'd rate it, and then Dick would come over to them and say, "So why'd you like this?" Say, "Well, it had a good beat. You could dance to it," and that was like their most important thing in the early '60s. What made good music was that you could dance to it. That's not what it is anymore, obviously. In some, if you're going out dancing, you want a good song that's good to dance to. But nonetheless, these are my 10 favorite and my reasons why I think they're so special. I hope you'd enjoy this. Thanks.